What's up, Keller Williams Realty Partners? We are coming to you with the seller point of view, the final video in I believe it's going to end up being a 5-video series, walking you through some of the things you should let your sellers know could happen during the transaction, and also in an effort to teach you the nuts and bolts of the transaction as well. Finally, we're going to talk about closing, why we are all here. It's time to sit down and eat candy and celebrate. But there are a few things you need to know about the closing. So I'll read here. In Georgia, an attorney is required to close a real estate transaction. Some people might mistakenly think because they closed in another state where only a title company is involved, but Georgia is an attorney state. Closings usually take about 1 hour to complete, but I have seen them take much longer. If you're dealing with a lender that has already sent the money and they don't require the documents to all be faxed back, sometimes this is be as little as 30 minutes, even if you're financing. But I've also sat waiting forever for funding to issue. There are a million different reasons why that could happen. So I would send this email out and make sure they know that most of the time it's going to take an hour, but sometimes it takes much longer for a myriad of different reasons. Please be sure, back to the reading, please be sure and bring your driver's license and another form of ID to the closing. I've only seen a few attorneys require the second form of ID. Almost always the driver's license is going to be enough. But I tell people just in case to bring another form of ID, and it could be something as simple as a credit card with your name on it. But the first one has to be either a driver's license or a state-issued ID for sure. That's one of the first things they're going to do is when that buyer and seller walk in, they're going to get a copy of their driver's license. The buyer gets to choose the closing attorney. That is almost always the case here in Georgia. Now, from time to time, you've got a seller that's done an extensive amount of title work because there was a title issue before and they're going to insist that they close it their attorney. Or sometimes you're willing to, because the buyer wants the house so badly, they're willing to let any closing attorney close it. I try to always send my closings, both sides, when I do a buyer or a seller, to Thomas & Brown, our preferred attorney. But, that sometimes that's not always the case. The closing attorney will reach out and ask you to complete a seller information sheet. By the way, y'all, it's very important that they fill this out right away. The closing attorney has to get certain information from the seller, even though they kind of work for the buyer. I guess technically they represent the transaction and the lender, but to be clear, they are going to send out a seller info sheet to the seller. They might do that through you, the listing agent, or they may reach out directly to them. Sometimes they have portals where they can do it. But they need to order a payoff, they need to order title, they need to order the HOA letter, which we'll talk about. It is very, very important, particularly if you have a short contract period, that the seller fill that out right away. Even if you have 30, 45 days, they need to fill that out right away so they can. I've seen it take forever just to get a mortgage payoff. It's silly, but it happens. Sometimes there are issues with title and they need to get that taken care of right away. So they need to fill out that seller info sheet as soon as possible. And again, back to the reading. Please fill this out. I'm sorry, I got confused. Please fill this out for them, meaning the attorney, and return it to them as quickly as possible to avoid delays in closing. You will owe and pay from your closing proceeds your portion of this year's property taxes at closing. So that's going to be a line item that the closing attorney will take out at closing. Many sellers mistakenly think they have already paid for the current year, but all property taxes are paid for the previous year in Georgia. So just know that chunk of money is going to be coming out of the seller proceeds. You may, however, and this is again to the seller, you may, however, have an escrow balance with your current mortgage company. Over the course of time, that account builds up for them to pay your property taxes. It's almost certainly going to be a wash for everybody involved. The seller. So they're going to get an escrow refund usually about 30 days after the closing for their property taxes and insurance that they paid through the lender. These funds will be mailed to you after closing. If you are part of a homeowners association, you may still owe dues to them for this year. Your HOA will almost certainly charge you several $100s for a closing letter to state that you don't owe them money or that they have not placed a lien on your property. Unfortunately, y'all, this is just one of the bitter realities of selling a house with an HOA. An HOA letter is very expensive for almost all HOAs. It's a very contentious topic these days. It's very expensive. So what that letter does is tells them, hey, look, this person does or does not owe us any money. They have or have not done anything to make us send them a violation notice. There is or is not a special assessment coming soon, and so on and so on. Now, most of the time, everybody's fine, and they just say, hey, look, the seller still owes us $240 for their portion of this year's HOA dues. In many cases, the HOA and the attorney will require these funds up front. They want to get that in as soon as possible. So I try to get my sellers to wait as long as humanly possible to do it. I'll reach out to the attorney and say, hey, when is the latest date we can pay for this? Because the last thing you want to do is pay for an HOA letter that you're not going to end up using because the buyer's terminated or the buyer's got declined or there was an appraisal issue and we couldn't work out. And that's why I write this here, back to the reading. I have seen sellers have to pay this fee multiple times when contracts fall through. Now, to be clear, I think a lot of HOAs may be willing to work with you and make sure the second letter isn't as expensive, but people have had to pay for that HOA letter multiple times again because the first contract fell out. So again, rare that happens, but the seller needs to know that's a possibility. Contact your HOA for information on such fees. They should already have done that when they filled out the community association disclosures, so they should know that's coming. But again, you want to tell them again, because the last thing you want to do is be sitting at closing and find out that, oh my gosh, there's another several $100 fee. And again, most of the time they'll find out about it earlier than that, because most attorneys are collecting that very early in the process, or at least halfway through. Back to the reading. Also, one of the line items due on your final closing statement will be your portion of this year's HOA dues. If there are any liens on the property whatsoever, those will have to be paid from closing proceeds as well. Sometimes there's a water bill due. Sometimes there's a lien that maybe even the seller didn't know about. All those are going to have to be paid or at least taken care of at closing or sometimes before. There will also be miscellaneous fees and charges from the closing attorney. These include fees to mail out your current mortgage payoff, wire your closing proceeds to your account, and other recording fees. These miscellaneous attorney's fees typically do not exceed a total of $100. Now, maybe it might be closer to $150 these days. Now, in general, the buyer is responsible for their closing costs unless otherwise stipulated in the contract. Usually the most a seller is going to have to pay, other than those other line items, the liens and so on, is about $100, $150 in attorney's fees. In the event you choose to receive a wire for your closing proceeds, be sure to bring your checkbook so the attorney will have wiring information. A lot of times they'll collect that wiring or bank account information up front so they know exactly where to wire it. I always encourage my sellers to bring their checkbook just in case it got lost or whatever. They're welcome to receive a check. A check is going to be free, but a lot of times you're talking about multiple tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands in seller proceeds. So the bank may hold the funds for a little while. With a wire, it's instantaneous, and usually it's in there by the time you get home from the closing. Although the buyer and seller get to pick the day of the closing appointment times are usually set by the attorney based on availability. You, as the listing agent or the buyer's agent, want to try to work with the co-op agent as soon as you can to try to get on the calendar as soon as you can, because those times fill up quick and you want it to be something agreeable between the two. I like to do all my closings in the morning, so I try to get on their calendar as soon as you can. If you're going to wait till several days before or even a week before, you may just have to deal with the time slot they have. It may be 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock or whatever. So I always tell the sellers to please be prepared to make arrangements at work for time off. Now, I've seen a lot of people try to just take an hour. If your closing lasts anything longer than that, you're going to have to they're going to have to explain to their boss why they're not back at work. So I'd probably take a half a day. That's what I always recommend. Appointment times for most all closing attorneys are Monday through Friday, 9 to 4. And this is fairly universal for almost all closing attorneys I've ever worked for. I will say this about the buyer getting to choose or the seller getting to choose the attorney. You could price shop these closing attorneys all over the city, and you're probably not going to find a $100, maybe $200 difference between any of them. And again, the buyer is on the hook for that. So for the most part, the seller is, at least as far as cost is concerned, the seller really shouldn't care where the closing takes place. If you cannot be at your closing, please let me know as soon as possible. And again, this is me talking to the seller. I need to make arrangements, or the seller needs to make arrangements, or any party to the contract needs to make arrangements to set up either a power of attorney or a mail away. Just remember, we have to have plenty of time to make sure that happens. The forms still have to be notarized in both cases, so we need plenty of time. If the seller or the buyer aren't going to be there or going to be out of town, we need to make sure we find someone who can sign for them as early as we can and get those documents notarized, because time is of the essence. And if we try to do this last minute, it's probably not going to work. The attorney will have to arrange for a power of attorney or a mail away, typically costing about $100. And that is the closing. Thanks for watching.